nothing used to feel better than that warm-up to my body. Like nothing. I was like, boom. Amazing. Feels so good. Talk to me. How does that feel for you? How many of you do that series, by the way? Most of you are pretty familiar with the movements, so yeah? Okay, cool. And for how many of you does that just feel like a great warm-up? Great, okay. So most of your bodies respond really well to it. Cool. For how many of you is this a problematic series? At least some point, there's something that's not great. Yeah.
When you adjusted me, I had to move my hands back. I don't exactly know how to get that flow, because with plank or whatever, I'm out, and then when I do back to down dog, I have to move my hands back, or I just can't.
And what's really funny about that is, when I used to teach adjustments, that's such a common reaction. People love to give this down dog adjustment of pushing the hips back and up, because it feels like a nice traction through the low back for the receiver. But probably every 10 times that I do that adjustment, maybe 3 times, people will do what you did, which is I'll come up to actually just press your hips back to give you some length, and you walked your hands back in response to it. You do. Yeah, you should. What I intend by giving you that stretch is for you to keep the hands in place and allow me to press the hips back, because it takes the stretch deeper into the leg. But it's a confusing adjustment for probably about 30% of the people you would give it to. You've probably had it and loved it, and so you're like, oh, just wait till I give you this sweet adjustment, and that will happen. Like I say, probably about 30% of the time, people will kind of walk back and not understand it. And then you're in a situation, especially with a flow sequence like Ashtanga, where there's not time for me to say like, oh no, walk your hands back out. Okay, stay there. Now I'm gonna, by then there's 3 more extra breaths that people are waiting around in, so it's tough. Yeah. I am very, very happy to see that none of you have shoulder injuries from the redundant amount of chaturangas that you're doing in that. Those of you who know body alignment know that having the arms in that close and then lowering, 9 times out of 10, if you were to get up and watch the rest of this room do chaturangas, you would see shoulders doing this, dropping like this. Okay? Not that there's anything wrong with that shape, but it puts a lot of challenge on the front of the shoulder. Times that by 10 or 20,000 repetitions. You think about how many times I've done that salutation? How many times do you do chaturanga in that salutation? Think about that. It's called repetitive stress injury, and it's very common in yoga. Shoulders. Anybody have shoulder issues? Oh, interesting. And do you find that chaturanga aggravates, supports, nothing?
Initially it did, and then I have a wonderful instructor who's also an osteopath, and I think because she knew that I had body awareness, she took some extra time with me to adjust my alignment.
Yep.
And it was just a small thing, but made a huge difference.
Aha, and what did she adjust, or he?
I was turning my shoulders in, and so she just had me spread them out and turn them out a little bit while I was down dog.
Nice.
And
nice.
Just focusing on that made a huge difference.
Beautiful. Okay. Good. All right, moving on. So shoulders seem to be okay in the room. Amazing. Yeah.
I have a question about this series. With my teacher who taught me this initially, the practice was slower, and that's something I prefer personally, just to go through the series a bit slower and hold each pose for like a little bit more time.
Yep.
From an instructor point of view, is that okay? Like for my personal practice or to teach other people?
Of course. If you were in a classic Ashtanga class, you would be moving at that pace. That's the count. And I probably didn't hold through the breath as much as I would have, because I didn't want us to spend too much time in it in case that was aggravating to any of you. This is the first time we've checked in with our posture. But usually it's a 4 count. Inhale, 2, 3, 4. Exhale, 2, 3, 4 for each of the breaths. So it feels like it's moving very quickly if you're unfamiliar to going in that pace. Once you've become acclimatized to that breath pace of movement, it doesn't feel as rushed. Would you agree with that? You've been doing that series for a while. Yeah, and eventually, actually, if it doesn't move that quickly, you're like agitated. You can always spot Ashtanga yogis in a class, because they're the ones that are like, if you stop to talk about anything, they're like, They just want to get going. So yeah, that's a modification on the series that people have done, because for a lot of people, sitting back into down dog, lunging that leg forward and getting all the way up into that in one breath, in the exhale, inhale, feels like a lot. Especially when you're on your 4th, 5th, 6th round of it and your heart rate's up, right? To slow that breath down enough to give you the time to make that lunge is intense. Yeah, so that's a modification. What you'll find is as you work through the Ashtanga sequence with your textbooks, that almost all of the postures you've done in yoga came from it. And someone has taken it and done something else with it. It's a wonderfully creative practice that way. So that's an example of it, just slowing it down a little. Yeah, cool. Okay, how about backs? Backs feeling okay? How many of you have any kind of back injury or issue or pain? Yeah, a few of you in here? Okay, feels all right in this series? Good, so to go from standing to straight into a forward fold, no problem. And then back into this giant back bend, it's feeling okay? All right, enjoy that.
I think I have to modify that for somebody. Like, I'm just thinking when I'm doing the mindfulness groups, I've got people who've never done any kind of physical of anything. And if you do have back issues, how would you kind of walk them through a series like that without having them
It's a very interesting question. So as we learn the Ashtanga sequence, I want you to always think of it as sort of ground zero. Like I say, it's like the posture sequence that almost everything else has drawn from. So your starting point with Ashtanga is this warm-up. Imagine someone with any kind of issue in, say, their low back doing this sequence. You wouldn't get past this part. How would you get them into downward dog without all of that flexion and extension? There's an extreme amount of flexion and extension, and especially if you're doing up dog. And especially if you're doing a straight-legged forward fold, like you're supposed to. Yeah, we'll get into that, for sure, very much so in the fall, but as you start to see how I've moved from Ashtanga into building the Pranalife flow, you'll see examples of attempting to maintain neutral stability, neutral spine stability, yeah. Cool. Hips, feels okay as you move through? It's kind of a nice sequence for the hips, actually. I like it. It always felt good in my hips. Like this sequence always felt good, period. It always felt so good to me, period. I never had issues with it until I had an issue. And then you become very aware, right? When you have a herniated or a bulging disc, man, you cannot do this sequence, yeah.
Would bulging discs or herniated discs come from the forward fold or from the back bends? Like, is there a compression between the lumbar or sacral joints or anything?
Beautifully, you are predicting this afternoon's content. Yeah, we're going to work through the spine this afternoon, and I will answer that question in that series, yeah. Rather than like blow the trailer to the movie, save it for the afternoon. Yeah.
I have a question about the breathing.
Yep.
Is it all the way into the abdomen, or do we stop around the rib cage? Like, how does it flow?
Isn't it interesting how yoga has made us doubt how we breathe? Isn't that interesting? We get like, you've been breathing a lot for your life, so you probably actually know. And we get in with this kind of, again, a type of OCD about like, how am I supposed to breathe? There are lots of answers to that in the yoga field, and I welcome you to jump into the research and jump into other resources and dig into that for yourself. What I would say is I would not want you to develop dysfunction around your breath. And some of that is, this comes from my own personal position on this. I think that there's a lot of practice in yoga of taking things that are autonomic and trying to make them consciously controlled. And I think that dysfunction can show up around that. I feel that way with pelvic floor work. I feel that way with breath work. And I feel that way with just the body's natural response to movement and our constant overriding of that in yoga, and how that can create some dysfunction. I think there's a base functionality to that, which is the motivation to correct dysfunction that's already there. But a lot of times you apply corrective measures to an entire room full of people who don't have that original dysfunction. And now they develop a kind of dysfunction out of like an anxiety around fixing a whatever, right? So breathe in a way that allows you to finish the 4 count, is how I would say it. And you will start to identify whether the way that you breathe supports that or not. And if it doesn't, then we would probably dive into, well, let's find out whether you're, maybe you're really tight through the back and you're doing a lot of the breathing up here. A lot of us are like that. We don't move around in that area very much. We spend a lot of time sitting where we mostly breathe here, right? But for the most part, if you just think about the diaphragm being your main breathing muscle, and then focus on that diaphragm, dropping as you inhale, relaxing, or coming back up and as you exhale, like a bellows that connects all the way around the ribs. That's really all you have to think about if you have to think about breathing at all. Yeah, it becomes a very terrifying way to be in the world if you have to like consciously tell yourself how to breathe, I think that's causing more anxiety than it's doing good. Yeah.
You did mention something about vocal coaches. So I sing, and my vocal coach is always telling me, don't breathe like you do in yoga.
Yeah.
It's a different kind of breathing.
Yes, that's their polite way of saying.
It isn't, because, she's always talking about support and from here, and I don't find it's that different. I have a lot of friends who are singers.
Yeah.
And they're saying the same thing. Don't breathe like you do in yoga when you sing, because it's a different type of support.
Yes, well, it comes from 2 main sources. So one is that yoga has a rather confusing way of talking about bandhas, which we're also talking about today. And they tend to emphasize keeping tight and closed right here. So when we inhale in yoga, we tend to inhale and suck in the belly as a classic traditional training. To have the belly in and the breath go into the ribs here, which is the opposite of what I have been taught in singing, which is to relax and allow the breath to move into the base of the pelvis. So that's one that's like, don't do it like yoga, because you don't want to be hard here, or you kind of block the voice through the body, right? The other one is certainly what is most commonly recognized in Bikram classes as that drag on the throat, which singing coaches are like, oh God, polyps, and yeah, that's so hard on your vocal cords, oh my gosh. So if you're planning on singing, ease up on that. That breath is, so it's hard. It's gonna be, welcome to the Alice in Wonderland experience that is becoming a yoga teacher, because you'll walk into classes now and it will be like all of the bodies in the room are talking to you once you learn this, right? And you'll never be able to stand in a room of people going, again, without being like, you just feel like you have to become a renegade, like lifesaver in there. But it's tricky. So usually that's what they're referring to when they say don't breathe the way that yoga teaches you to breathe. Yeah. But outside of that, there's always, like, again, this is an unregulated market. So part of the challenge that we have here, and part of what we're going to do here, is just try to iron out some wrinkles that have come from just this myriad resource center. One of the things I like about yoga is that it's unregulated. So there's all these like creative pockets all over the place. People just doing whatever they're interested in trying. And sometimes some really cool stuff comes out of that. But sometimes charismatic or well-known teachers adopt not great cues or not great ways of instructing, and it just sort of proliferates through the community. So we have to kind of iron those things out. You know what I mean? And things like that dragon breath, I think, are one of them that, and yogis are so friggin' intense. Like, we love to take stuff and then be like, I'm gonna do that every day. We get, like, that breath was never really like that. If you go back to the source of Ujjayi, it was really never a big drag like that. But for some reason, we brought it in here, and it had to become this thing that, like, the room could hear, So, yeah.
But then your breath today that we just did, the gentle flogging of the hand here, should we, you're trying to do that all the way through Surya A B?
In an Ashtanga practice, you use Ujjayi through the entire practice. Now, if you were to, if you were to go to India now, that Pattabhi Jois has passed, his grandson Shrat is teaching, he's much less rigorous about that breath. His idea is it's a 4-count breath. The idea of that drag, the information that comes out of that training is a bit conflicting, but it seems like he's more like, well, sure, yeah, do that or don't. A little bit more chill about it. Yep.
I've chose from a medical standpoint that breathing style kind of interesting, because it does cause like a pressure on the airway to keep all the airway open, so it controls your exhalations.
Yes.
People with chronic lung conditions, for instance, would have a tendency to do something like that as well, to kind of to hold on to their oxygen as much as they can. So,
Yes.
like I always kind of go back to how they figured this out, like the chakras and
Yeah, I know.
it sort of sits with a lot of the nervous system and placement of it, something thousands of years ago.
Absolutely. There's certain things that you're like, when they talk about, if you read the Hatha Yoga Pradipika and they talk about the nectar of the mind dripping from the third eye and informing all of the chakras of the body, and you're just like, whoa, that's like the main center of your endocrine system, and that's exactly basically what it does, right? And like, how would they know? And they describe it like about an inch above the brow, about an inch or two back in the brain. You're like, were they cutting people open? Because I'm pretty sure they were doing there's some aliens from outer space came in, talked about this, like travelers from the future talking to them. Sometimes there's stuff that's like, whoa, that's pretty insightful. But it's important to not become very absolutist about the information. That's cool. That doesn't mean everything that yogis teach is mystically, magically accurate, in my opinion. And the same breath, that the reason for that restriction really is in some sense to slow your breathing down so that you can hit the 4 count, right? So don't just and let it all out. Sort of constrict it a bit so that it takes some time to come in and out of the lung. Creates a little bit of resistance. It's certainly actually a good training. I find as someone with asthma that it can aggravate my asthma because I already have a sense of restriction. I would have a breathing dysfunction around wanting to restrict the breath. So I have to let go of that habit in order to not amplify an asthma attack. So it's like personal, right? Your practice is becoming personal.